Hello, I'm Nathan Martin with the Divine Pollination Hive and the UnityProcess.com. In today's video, I'm going to be discussing the two games. There's two versions of Unity. There's two games simultaneously being played on Earth as we speak. And not just on Earth, but actually in our galaxy and maybe even our universe. If learning more about the two games interests you, stay tuned. According to Simon Sinek, the author of Start With Why, there are two games that can be played, the infinite and the finite. Infinite, the goal of the game is progression and to keep the game going. Finite, the goal of the game is to defeat others within a certain set of rules that is fair for everyone. Sports are finite games. According to Simon Sinek, joy comes not from comparison, but from advancement. And that's from the video Understanding the Game We're Playing, which is linked below. When two or more people are playing an infinite game, things run smoothly. When two or more people are playing a finite game, things run smoothly. When somebody attempts to play a finite game with infinite rules, things will not run smoothly, and the infinite player will find it difficult to win. When somebody attempts to play an infinite game with finite rules, things will not run smoothly, as the finite player will attempt to win against the infinite player who is just seeking to progress within the infinite game. Infinite players seek to be empowered and to empower others, while finite players seek to be powerful over others and gravitate to positions of power over others. They will treat leadership positions as positions of power over others, when leadership positions are actually meant to be positions of inspiration and holding a vision. Simon Sinek gives the example of a CEO of a company and how they can either be an infinite player or a finite player of the game. The CEO can see their employees as subordinates, pawns, and assets to reach a bottom line of profitability, or he can see them as co-creators in their company's infinite progression. Companies can compete against other companies, or they can seek to progress and compete against themselves. He gives an example of Microsoft and Apple. He did some presentations at both companies, and the Microsoft was always talking about how to beat Apple, and Apple was just talking about their vision and how they could progress. And so there was two different companies with two different sets of rules playing two different games. One was trying to play a game against Apple, the other, Apple, was trying to play a game against itself. Simon Sinek gives the example of wars that become quagmires for those seeking to win versus those seeking to progress with both the Vietnam and the Afghanistan wars. The USA was attempting to play a finite game to win, while the Vietnamese people were playing an infinite game to continue on as they were. The Soviets were attempting to play a finite game to win, while the Afghans were playing an infinite game to continue on as they were. Consciousness also has two games that are being played, and they have different sets of rules. There is a version of Unity consciousness for each version of the game, and there is also a locus of control type for each version of the game. The finite game has an external locus of control, meaning that the perception views the external as cause and the internal as effect. Predator and prey are two fundamental aspects of this game, as are the concepts of survival of the fittest and competition. Finite Unity consciousness is external, and is achieved by lumping consciousness into one singular thing and making them the same. But to do this, it must assimilate through domination, seduction, and subversion. Light and darkness are in a struggle and competition against each other. The infinite game has an internal locus of control, meaning that the perception views the internal as cause and the external as effect. Uniqueness and equality are fundamental aspects of this game, as are the concepts of cooperation and harmony. Infinite Unity consciousness is internal and is achieved by separating consciousness into individual units while still staying aligned and connected at their source, consciousness. Light and darkness are integrated and working together to progress. They're harmonious. We live within a hybrid reality where both games are currently being played side by side, and is populated by souls who have one of the two views of reality. This is the only true duality. All other dualities are manufactured within the finite game of competition. Distinctions between the two polarities exist in both versions of the game. Although they behave differently in each, they are oppositional in the finite game, while they are co-creative and harmonious in the infinite game. And when I mean polarities, I mean positive and negative, and north and south, teacher and student, parent and child, those kinds of distinctions. There are several areas of life that can be played as either a competitive finite game or an infinite game of progression. For example, sex. Sex can be domination and submission. It can be a power play. It can be a game of dominance. It can be a game of conquering. How often are women considered the prey and men are the predators who are seeking them out and preying upon them? That is a finite game. However, sex between two conscious partners can be something completely different. It doesn't have to be a power play or a domination play. It's not a game of conquering. It's a game of progression. How can we use sexuality to progress ourselves? How can we use our sexuality to not just enlighten, but to really just continue to create our desires? Financial. In financial, you can have competitive finite, which is greed and sacrifice, or you can have abundance, which is infinite. Business, the same way. You can be a CEO who leads through example, or you can be a CEO who sees everybody as a means to a bottom line. Politics. Most politicians, if not all politicians, in the current way politics is done, are all externalized in an external locus of control. Left or right, they are the same. They are in this competitive finite game, and they're fighting against each other, or they're made to appear like they're fighting against each other, but they're really working for an overlord that's really dictating through like a shadow government what they're supposed to do. Relationships, they can be finite or infinite. Again, just like sex, you can have these power play relationships, relationships of domination, submission. A lot of parents act this way. Or you can parent in a way where you're empowering your children, where you're asking them questions and letting them figure things out for themselves. Sports, you can have competitive sports or you can compete against yourself. Nationality, regions, cities, communities, us versus them, competing. Or we're breaking down in nationalities because we are individuating and seeing what different kinds of cultures we can create and how we can work together as communities. So we might all be one human people, but we're breaking down into these communities, nationalities, etc., because we're part of the infinite game. So the way you look at nationality can be infinite or finite. Lastly, religious affiliations. You can be infinite in your version of religiousness, which is more like mysticism, or you can have your exoteric spirituality and religious affiliations where it's my religion versus your religion, and where our religions are fighting against each other in a competition, a win-lose kind of thing. Mine is better because, yours is worse because. The differentiation between the two games has been called many things throughout the years and has been misunderstood as a bloodline, but it is not a bloodline. The players of the infinite are called the children of Adam, the Jews, wizards, royalty, and blue bloods, while the players of the finite game are called the pre-Adamites, the Goyim or Gentiles, the Muggles, the peasants, and the common people. Jesus made the distinction of calling the two groups the wheat and the tares. We are in a unique situation in this dimension where those in the internalized infinite game can drop down into the externalized finite game of competition, and where those in the externalized finite game can ascend into the infinite game of progression. We're not stuck where we're at. We can actually join the other game if we so choose. Now, I don't think it's healthy to join the competition game, to drop down into the finite game. I think it's much more healthy to really leave the finite game behind and to start to progress in the infinite game. The players of the infinite game are meant to inspire the players of the finite game to join them in the infinite game, but they have so far failed to take up their responsibility as players in the infinite game. Instead, the players of the finite game have devised a way to trap the players of the infinite game in a matrix of control, to use them as a means of extending the finite game of domination and control indefinitely. They plan to use the infinite or eternal players as batteries to achieve immortality, because the finite game is not sustainable. but the infinite game that stays connected to source is sustainable. So they're going to use the sustainable people and put them in a negative feedback loop and then use them as batteries. Our current society is set up specifically with the rules of the finite game, and our schools condition in the rules of the finite to make the children pawns in the finite game. Psychopaths are a type of being who are emotionally deficient and are adept at playing the finite game more than most. They tend to rise to the top of positions of externalized power. They are able to do this because they do not have typical restrictions of empathy and compassion hardwired into their being. Thus, they are able to do whatever it takes to rise up the hierarchies of power, including the use of predatory and/or parasitic behaviors. This is why a lot of CEOs these days, bankers, politicians, etc., are psychopaths. They've risen up the ladder, and they're really willing to do whatever it takes to win, and that makes them really good in this environment or this finite environment. I'm not saying that this finite environment is a good thing itself. They just are a very good match for the finite game. Government types that best represent the finite game are communism, communitarianism, fascism, socialism, crony capitalism, state capitalism, monarchies, feudalism, and religious theocracies. Government types that best represent the infinite game are anarchy, voluntarism, and entrepreneurial capitalism, all which require an internal sovereignty rather than an externalized sovereignty. Communitarianism is very interesting. It's possibly what's going to be happening after the shift in consciousness in our world. It's kind of like the next deception. Communitarianism is where the individual serves the community. It is a counterfeit of anarchy and voluntarism, where in anarchy and voluntarism, the community serves individuality. So anything that's not serving the individuality of the person is really going to be the finite game. Whenever you're serving the community, it is the finite game and not the infinite game. The United States of America was born as a hybrid of the two forms of the game, as there were strong forces that wanted more individuality, as seen with the states' rights groups, and then there were those who wanted a more federalized American Union with a strong central federal government. The states' rights people were kind of more like the anarchists, and they just wanted individual sovereignty, and they wanted a loose federation, very loose, really a lot like anarchists like. And this was a very unique experiment in America because it had never been done before. But then there was also those forces that really wanted the more federalized government and a union, and that is the externalized finite version. Can you guess which of these two forces seemingly won out in the American experiment? Why? Both the conservative and liberal, right and left political leanings are currently furthering the strong federal finite game in world politics. The conservatives give lip service to the rules of the infinite game while maintaining actions that prove otherwise, while the liberals are more openly professing the rules of the finite game in the name of empathy and compassion. Both sides of the political spectrum are an externalized farce, though, as it is up to the development of each individual's uniqueness, creativity, and internal locus of control that will actually transform our external government. Our current governmental system reflects our collective external locus of control, while any new governmental system will need to reflect our newly developed collective internal locus of control. Holarchy and hierarchy. Hierarchy is the representative consciousness model for an external locus of control in the finite game. Hierarchy can be visualized as a top-down pyramid where those on the top rule over those on the bottom. Equality in the hierarchical model is based on making everyone equally a slave at the bottom and giving everyone an equal opportunity to rise up through the ranks of hierarchy. Hierarchy thrives on one-dimensional thinking and keeping each group of the hierarchy unaware or in competition with the other groups within the hierarchy. It requires compartmentalization of the various factions and fracturing of the various personalities within it. The historical Cold War between the East and West was a perfect example of two sides that were in competition against each other, but are still both owned by the same higher entity in the hierarchy. Hierarchy is vampiric and requires the consumption of external resources to sustain itself. It is not self-sustaining. Holarchy is the representative consciousness model for an internal locus of control in the infinite game. Holarchy can be visualized as a 2D flower of life, which is a 3D torsion field comprised of many smaller individual torsion fields. Holarchy is a hologram reality of fractals that scale infinitely in all directions. Equality in the holarchic model is based on the fact that we are all equally connected to our source, and each person has a capacity to eventually create our own universe in our infinite progression. Holarchy is self-sustaining and is able to draw on the infinite resources of the zero-point field or source from the inside out. To progress in the infinite game, we must change our thinking, because we have been purposely trained to think finitely within our current educational, religious, and societal systems. Richard Paul, in his 2007 keynote speech, Critical Thinking in Every Domain of Knowledge and Belief, had this to say. And I'm actually just taking excerpts from this, I'm not reading the entire thing. Every discipline says it's focusing on critical thinking. The Foundation for Critical Thinking did a 3-year study that focused on 28 private universities and 38 public universities, including Stanford, UCLA, Caltech, Berkeley, and so forth. We interviewed faculty. We found, when asked this question, is critical thinking a primary objective of your instruction, a secondary objective of your instruction, or neither, the overwhelming majority of the faculty said primary. One of my primary goals is to foster the critical thinking of my students. Then we asked them, tell us a little bit about your concept of critical thinking and how you go about teaching students. Here, the characteristic answer was either exceedingly vague, and you can't teach a vague concept, or highly limited, in which some would say, oh well, I foster critical thinking by reminding students to notice their assumptions. Others would say, I foster students considering other points of view. And a third might say, I warn them on how important the data are. Let me give you a logical parallel. Suppose I claimed to teach carpentry and explained how I did it as follows. Yes, I do teach carpentry. I emphasize the hammer. Or yes, I do. I focus on the skill saw. Critical thinking is not one isolated skill. It is not even a random list of skills. It's an orchestrated way of thinking that enables you to decompose your thinking at any given moment. It encompasses basic structures integrated together into a whole. It assesses thinking for its quality, for its clarity, for its accuracy, for its precision, for its relevance. It raises thinking thereby to a higher quality. It makes it better. Critical thinking is a way of teaching, a way of learning, a way of being in the world in which the thinker self-monitors and self-assesses. We asked the faculty, do your students come to you with adequate intellectual standards? The overwhelming faculty in the study said no, students come to me without adequate intellectual standards. Do you teach students intellectual standards? Virtually all respondents said yes. We then asked, could you enumerate some of the intellectual standards you teach and give us some examples of how you encourage their use in the classroom, in the assignments, and in the tests? Oh, well, that's a hard question. I would need to think about that. Well, if critical thinking and intellectual standards are something that is of importance to faculty, they think about them. They know what they are. They can explicitly explain them. Thus, self-deception exists at the universities. Faculty commonly deceive themselves as to what their students are learning. Frequently, they cannot see, truly, what the process of schooling is doing to the minds of students. Later in the presentation, he says, I was educated as a philosopher. Philosophers think of themselves as helping people to live something like a rational life, living the examined life. College catalogs tell us about this, to be Socratic, to be a questioner. Okay, so I took a course that I was teaching, an upper division course for philosophy majors called Philosophical Reasoning, and I gave the students an essay by John Austin at Oxford. Very clear writing, very clear thinking. And I said, state the purpose of the essay. State the main question that Austin considers. State the information he uses in answering these questions. Give us his basic conclusion. Identify his assumptions. Then characterize his point of view. Then I read the student papers. What did they do? They argued with John Austin, disagreeing with him, before they understood what he was saying. So I went back to the department and said, look, We're turning our majors into sophists. Our majors aren't learning to think with discipline. They're learning to be argumentative. They're learning to be arguers. And furthermore, their understanding is impeded because they're stereotyping authors they are reading. What did the department do? Thank you very much, Richard. Your thoughts are always provocative. Nothing, nothing, nothing. Seemingly, they didn't care. They didn't care what the evidence was. They questioned, rather, whether I had followed the protocol for research. But this wasn't research. This was reporting on departmental performance of a class. Oh no, they said, it became research when you did this and this. And by the way, you didn't get the students' permission for this. What did they want to do? To shut me up, of course. And they successfully did. For I thought, is it worth it? No. This piddly department, it's not important. It's the big picture that's important. It's the way the field does this systematically. It's the way faculty are transformed into cultivators of argumentation rather than cultivators of fair-minded critical thinking. So what did he do? He made his website. He made his foundation. He started writing a bunch of books on critical thinking. That's what he did. He couldn't transform them, but he did get a bigger vision to help with the overall problem. So what is our solution? So near the end of this, he says, we need to discover the extent to which our thinking is bound by a culture. Cultures are good in many ways, but to the extent that they lock us into one way of looking at the world, we need to transcend them. We need to think beyond them. Why is this important? It's important because we, as creatures, are deeply determined in our life and in our behavior and in our character and in other ways, are determined by our thinking. We have no choice but to be governed by thought. The question is, do we govern the thought that governs us? Ideas control us. Do we control them? Reversing the process so that we're in the driver's seat, so that we're doing the thinking we need to do as well as we can, is what critical thinking is about. Our future as a species is dependent on whether we can develop the wherewithal to raise our collective thinking so as to produce positive changes in societies across the world. So here's my solutions. First, we need to make a conscious decision to play the infinite game. We need to consciously decide that the finite game's no longer for me. I don't want to play it anymore. I want to play the infinite game. I want to play the eternal game. Second, we need to hold on to the vision of progression rather than winning as our ultimate goal. We want to progress. We don't want to win anymore. This isn't about winning. It's about progressing. Third, we need open-mindedness and intellectual humility. Intellectual humility is not like typical humility. It actually means, I don't know it all. It realizes that, hey, I don't know it all. I'm going to keep asking questions. I'm going to keep asking questions even of people who aren't necessarily intellectually competent or intellectually honest or even intellectually humble. We're going to ask questions of everything. Fourth, we're going to do shadow work. Shadow work is extremely important. It's delving into the unconscious aspects of ourselves, into our unconscious feelings, our unconscious patterns, and working through them, shining the light of consciousness on them so that we can really understand why we act and feel and think as we do. Emotional processing. When we feel bad, we're going to process our emotions. We're going to feel our emotions. We're going to work through our emotions. We're going to use shadow work also. Self-reflection. We're going to examine our thinking. We're going to ask lots and lots of questions. What is the meaning of life? Why am I behaving this way? Why am I acting this way? Why? We're going to ask why until we're blue in the face, and then after we're blue in the face, we're going to keep asking why. Seventh, we need to start placing standards on our thinking. We need to actually take the intellectual standards, those listed before, and we need to place them on our thinking. And then we need to assess our thinking. That means not only putting the standards on our thinking, but then assessing whether or not we're staying within those standards. Are we meeting these standards of thinking? Are we being fair-minded? Are we being clear? Are we being relevant? Are we being deep, etc.? So this is the two games, the infinite and the finite. You have those who are definitely interested in keeping us stuck in the finite game. But if we really do transform this and we progress, we get into the mindset of progression, we leave behind this finite game, we can make a difference for a lot of people, even people who are psychopaths or, deeply damaged. We can help them as well. We can hold that standard. We can be standard bearers for humanity and for all beings in our universe. But we have to really first make that conscious decision to start progressing in the infinite game again and to really put down our competition. If you enjoyed this video, please click like. If you'd like to stay up to date with my videos, please subscribe. If you would like to be notified via email whenever I release a new video, please click the bell next to subscribe. If you have any comments or questions or would like to go into a dialogue about this topic, please leave them in the comments section below. I'm Nathan Martin with the Divine Pollination Hive and the UnityProcess.com. Be safe, be sovereign, be well.